Welcome. I'm your host, Cameron Taylor, and thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Last Decade Tonight. I want to jump straight into it tonight as we venture into the depths of the EU in the mystical and magical times of 2009. 2009 brought us so many things, such as President Obama being inaugurated, James Cameron's Avatar first hitting theaters, and of course everyone's favorite, the start of the Eurozone Debt Crisis. The European Union, or the EU, is an economic union formed in 1993 and is now comprised of 28 member states. The EU combined the economic strength of the powerhouses of Europe, being England, France, and Germany, with the more diverse and smaller countries such as Sweden and Belgium. There are many benefits to joining the European Union for these countries that included the freedom of mobility between countries, a shared common currency called the euro, and a wealth of opportunities of trade for the countries. But not everything was golden for our friends out east, as following the credit crisis of 2008, the EU faced a similar crisis, now dubbed the Eurozone Crisis. Our main story tonight revolves around the Eurozone Crisis and answering some key questions. Number 1, what was the Eurozone Crisis? Number 2, how did the euro impact the crisis resolutions? And lastly, number 3, what was done to solve the issue and how effective was it? To start, we need to examine what the Eurozone is. The Eurozone contains 19 of the 28 member countries of the EU that all adopted the common currency called the euro in 2002. These are the 19 countries that all adopted the currency and currently make up the Eurozone. Due to the fact that the currency is shared between these countries, national governments do not create their own monetary policies. Instead, the European Central Bank, or the ECB, sets monetary policy for the entire zone. In the Eurozone, countries' banks were interdependent on each other for capital flow. Banks would lend money in the form of bank loans to other banks in a vicious cycle that worked until it didn't. The primary lenders were the banks and investors in the core of the EU, being Germany, France, and the Netherlands, while the primary receivers of these loans were the periphery countries, being Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. The cycle continued on, resulting in the periphery countries being extremely indebted to the core countries. In 2011 alone, these four countries had an inflow of 232 billion euros, while only an outflow of 49 billion, meaning that they were borrowing nearly 5 times as much as they were investing themselves. But that's okay, because everything always goes right? Wrong. The Eurozone crisis started almost immediately following the end of the credit crisis in 2009. When the credit crisis hit, those big European lenders didn't want to lend any money away, as they were worried about the health of the market. And what do you get when you have countries that rely on foreign lending and foreign lenders that don't want to give away a dime? Well, it starts with a C and ends with a risis. That's right, you've got a full-blown crisis. The first country to feel the impacts of the Eurozone crisis was Greece, who boomed in the early 2000s with the ease of capital flow, but in 2009 had an extremely high government budget. When the recession hit and tax dollars dropped, the government budget quickly became unsustainable, and in 2009 it was reported that Greece's budget deficits had exceeded 15% of the GDP. As Greece's debt rose higher and higher, investors began demanding that Greece paid back some of the money they owed, and Greece's credit rating eventually dropped so low that it scared off any other investors. Greece became a black hole for money, and eventually nobody wanted to give them any more of it. Greece's problems soon spread to other countries, as there was concern that the Eurozone was not capable of handling a problem of this magnitude. The Eurozone lacked institutions that would have helped absorb some of the shocks of the crisis, and the EU was completely unprepared to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. Similar problems to Greece's credit crisis sprouted up in Portugal, Spain, Ireland, and Italy. Granted, these countries were not nearly as indebted as Greece was, but with the sudden stop of capital flow, they were unable to refinance their debts. There's not just one country to point at and blame for the Eurozone crisis, but it was a combination of excessive spending in the periphery countries and the banks and investors in the core countries that led to the events of the crisis. However, we cannot talk about the Eurozone crisis without mentioning the role that the euro played in it. The only real benefit of a country facing a period of economic weakness is that the value of your national currency will decrease. And while that may sound like a bad thing, and typically it is, when the value of the national currency decreases, it allows exports to become more attractive to other countries. Typically, this is one of the key steps that countries use to recover from times of economic weakness, and is one of the key factors in recovering from an economic crisis. In a situation like this, though, where 19 countries share the common currency of the euro, that same devaluation of the currency cannot be used. When just one country is facing a period of economic weakness, the value of the currency did not decrease significantly. Even with 5 countries facing periods of economic weakness, the euro did not decrease significantly enough that it was helpful in these countries recovering from the crisis. Simply put, the euro just impacted and complicated resolutions that were going to be put in place, and then not being able to devalue the euro is what really caused complications in solving this crisis. Well, now that we know what the crisis is and how it started, what was done to solve it? The main players in the resolution were the EU leaders, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the European Central Bank, or the ECB. Over the course of 2010 to 2012, a series of plans and bailouts were rolled out to all the heavily indebted countries, being Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Ireland. One key plan were the austerity measures, which were plans to reduce the country's spending. Starting in February of 2010, Greece announced their first austerity package aimed at reducing their spending and solving the deficit by freezing the salary of government employees, a 10% cut in bonuses, and cuts of overtime workers. This was the first of 7 austerity packages that Greece unveiled between 2010 and 2013. These packages were not publicly supported, primarily because they cut the salaries of government, private, and public employees, raised taxes, and cut bonuses. Following these austerity measures, bailouts began to be rolled out to all the indebted countries. On May 2nd, 2010, the Eurozone and the IMF agreed to a €110 billion bailout of Greece. After this, bailouts were given to Ireland in November 2010, totaling $85 billion. $78 billion was given to Portugal in May of 2011, and a second package of $93 billion was given to Greece in July of 2011. In an attempt to keep this crisis from spreading, the ECB bought up Spanish and Italian government bonds, and then Italy passed a new austerity budget. Later in 2011, the ECB unveiled emergency loan measures to help out banks in debt. And on October 26, 2011, European leaders announced their new plan dubbed the Three-Pronged Agreement, where banks holding Greece debts agreed to a 50% loss. The Eurozone bailout fund would be boosted, and banks would agree to raise more capital. In 2012, in order for Greece to receive another bailout, they were required to make another €325 million budget cuts, promoting the most substantial austerity bill yet. Passed on February 12th, this bill cut minimum wage by 22%. It cut 150,000 government jobs by 2015 and substantial pension cuts. Needless to say, this bill was not very popular, but it was enough to secure the next bailout package totaling €130 billion and save the country from sovereign defaulting. It's also important to mention other parties that got involved in the crisis resolutions, such as the G7 and G20 groups. Both these groups ended up meeting during the times of the crisis between 2010 and 2013, but they didn't really have much of an impact in resolving the crisis. Now that we know what was done to solve the crisis, how successful were these bailouts and austerity measures? And to answer honestly, we still don't know whether or not these countries will be able to make a full recovery, but looking at it from right now, they worked pretty well. The austerity measures implemented will have long-lasting effects on their respective countries and on Europe as a whole, for many years still to come. These countries will likely have little growth, maintain a high government debt to GDP ratio, and will have no shortage of civil unrest. At this point, just 7 years removed from the crisis, we can look at a number of different economic indicators to get a general sense of how these countries are doing now. The very first thing to look at is, are these countries still around today? Quite clearly, the answer is yes, and I'd say that's 1 point for the success of these programs. The next important indicator would be GDP growth. Looking at the growth of the Eurozone, we can see that following the measures, growth resumed in 2014, going from just negative 0.86% in 2012 to 1.42% in 2014. More specifically, we can see this trend in individual nations affected by the crisis. Greece nearly halved their negative GDP growth rate from negative 7.3% in 2012 to just negative 3.2% in 2013. The same can be seen for Portugal, who went from negative 4% to just negative 1.1% in the same time frame. The next thing to look at are unemployment rates. Directly following the end of the crisis, unemployment rates were at an all-time high in places like Greece, who hit unemployment of nearly 27.5% in 2013. Obviously, extreme unemployment is a very, very bad thing, and it's clear to see that it was caused by these austerity measures. But to look at the success of these programs implemented, we should look at today's statistics and not 2013 statistics. In 2018, Greece's unemployment was at 19.8%. Now compare that to any other country and it looks awful, but compared to Greece just 5 years prior, and it looks a little bit better. Unemployment is expected to continue dropping, and eventually within the next decade get back to somewhat reasonable levels. Once again, a similar trend can be seen in Portugal, who back in 2013 had an unemployment rate of 16.2%, but in 2018, that number has gone down to about 8%. A decade later, and the effects of the Eurozone crisis are still being felt across Europe. Some improvements have been made and conditions have gotten better in many of the countries impacted, but the long-lasting effects of the crisis and its solutions will still be felt in the next decade. And now, this.
That's it, baby. That's it.
Go! Don't touch the home plate!
Baby. Let's go!
Moving on. Our last story tonight is a little catch-up on Brexit. Now keep in mind that anything I say on Brexit will probably be outdated in 24 hours' time, so as of right now, April 6th, 2019, the UK does not have an exit deal. Right now, Britain is set to leave the EU in just 6 days' time on April 12th with a no-deal Brexit, meaning that no agreements have been made between the UK and the EU to govern their relationship following their breakup. Right now, Theresa May, the Prime Minister of Britain, had put in a request to delay the Brexit date back to June 30th, and it is up to the EU to either accept or deny this request. The leaders of the EU will be meeting on April 10th to discuss this. This is not the first time that Theresa May has requested a delay to June 30th. In fact, she was denied this same request just 1 month prior, and the date was only pushed back to April 12th. It is likely that the EU will grant another extension, but not to June 30th. Instead, a flexible one-year extension will likely be made where if a deal is met, the extension can be cut short, and if no deal is met, then in 1 year's time, the UK will be leaving the EU. So, that catches us up to date, but doesn't explain why these negotiations have been taking so long. What has been stalling Brexit? One issue is the denial of withdrawal agreements. Theresa May has proposed 3 different withdrawal agreements, and 3 times they have been voted down by the British MPs. This is because these agreements are generally unfavourable for Britain, and the British MPs don't want any of it. Due to the fact that both the UK and the EU would prefer not to have a no-deal Brexit, the Brexit date just got pushed further and further back, therefore stalling the exit. The main issue stalling negotiations has been the Irish border issue. Essentially, what this boils down to is that Northern Ireland is part of the UK, while the Republic of Ireland is not. So, if the UK leaves the EU, that means a border will have to be created between the two countries. This would deny the free flow of people, goods, and capital, which is a major issue for the people who live on or near the border. Both the UK and the EU have agreed not to have a hard border, meaning any physical substances, but even a soft border, being just security checks, could be very disruptive. This issue is so important to the people of Ireland that there was even a 30-year conflict between British and Irish governments that took place just 20 years ago. It was only in 1998, when the Good Friday Agreements were signed, that ended this conflict surrounding the governing of Northern Ireland, and now just 20 years later, Brexit is going to mess all of that up. From the way I see it, the UK has 3 options, and all of these depend on the EU's decision to grant an extension on April 10th. The UK's first option is to take the extension and come up with an agreed-upon deal in the year's time frame, leaving the EU with the proper accords put in place. The UK's second option, which I think is probably the least likely to happen, is a no-deal Brexit, where following the 1-year extension, the UK leaves the EU with no agreements put in place. Britain's last option is actually to cancel the Brexit. Yes, this can actually happen. The European Court of Justice ruled back on December 10th, 2018 that the UK could simply cancel their Article 50 application and remain a member of the EU. This third option would likely require a second public referendum, which would have to be put in law by the British government. One of these things is almost guaranteed to happen within the next year, and is up to the people of the UK to decide what happens. This has been our show. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you next week. Take care.